Well, you figure they're gonna overload us with bombs, so it's gonna be about 30 to 1 will crash and blow up on takeoff, right? Then they're gonna probably throw every fighter they got at us. So basically, we're finished.
If you've been following RetroBlasting for any length of time, you know that I have an avid interest in World War II history, and you've probably seen the War Stories series of live streams that I do with Tony and Master Son 42. That series is coming back at the end of March when Masters of the Air wraps up on Apple TV. The series was just on hiatus while we took a break. We'd never intended to cancel it, and it is coming back with a discussion about Masters of the Air. There have been a lot of questions that have been thrown my way the last few weeks because people know I'm interested in World War II and specifically World War II aviation, especially World War II aviation. Have I been watching the show? What do I think of it? Do I recommend it? Melinda and I have been keeping up with the show, and it's really, really good. I would ignore the internet critics on this one that are writing these bad reviews of it on websites and whatnot. They don't have any perspective on history, and they don't know what they're watching. I actually I read one critic say that the Masters of the Air miniseries takes place in the Band of Brothers universe, which is ridiculous since it's historically based and it's World War II. There is no multiverse or cinematic universe that is this World War II versus that World War II. So what I would say is read reviews of Masters of the Air with caution. The critics, the current spate of critics that are talking about it right now, they don't have any perspective or context for what they're watching by and large, and they're dumping on a show that is really, really solid. And I can't say that for other miniseries of that milieu outside of Band of Brothers. I've tried a few of the others, including The Pacific, which I think, while an admirable effort, did not capture the magic that was Band of Brothers, the gravitas of Band of Brothers, and the importance of Band of Brothers. This miniseries, while the episodes aren't completed yet, so I'm not going to count all my chickens until my eggs hatch, it is turning out to be a very, very compelling, solid, and historically accurate to the best of its ability miniseries. That being said, a lot of people have been asking me about it, and I thought, well, I can't talk about it until it's over yet, but what I can do, because of my background, is provide you all with a recommended list of other films about the 8th Air Force and flying fortresses, specifically B-17 flying fortresses, that you might find interesting. My background with World War II, while those of you who watch the channel know of my great admiration and obsession with the Royal Air Force, the Battle of Britain, and the pilots of the RAF, my interest in World War II began because of the 8th Air Force and the B-17 flying fortresses. As a kid, I was growing up in a family that was from Memphis, Tennessee. I was living in Nashville, but my family was from Memphis, and they were literally around the real plane all the time, to the point that I was allowed special access inside the Memphis Belle when I was in middle school. And that was a massive, just an amazing experience for a kid who was fascinated by World War II aviation. I would eventually go on to help restore the radio room at the original RAF Bassingbourn Air Tower, where the Memphis Belle operated in 1942 and 1943. The pilot of the Memphis Belle would show up on the day of the 50th anniversary, May 17th, 1993, and he would personally present me with my Eagle Scout medal. And then I would go on to ravenously, read and research all kinds of World War II stuff in the intervening years. But the Memphis Belle and the 8th Air Force and the B-17 Flying Fortress have been a big part of my life, like a big part of my life. I would go on in my 20s to interviewing surviving 8th Air Force veterans, and I did that for quite a while, several years during and after grad school, and that was an invaluable, priceless experience, I'll say that much. And then when the Memphis Belle was finally taken back by the 8th Air Force Museum and restored over a 10-year period and put in the National Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, my father and I made a pilgrimage to be there for the unveiling of the plane. because we both grew up around it. My father more so than me because he grew up in Memphis, where I grew up visiting Memphis often. So as part of that, I have been watching 8th Air Force movies and Flying Fortress movies my whole life. And so I thought if you're interested in Masters of the Air, you might want to know about some of these other movies. The really funny part about this is that as I was pulling these movies together from my film collection, which I owned almost all of them except for the ones that are either difficult to get on DVD or never came out on any physical media, I realized there's also an unintended trilogy that has happened within this genre of filmmaking. Now, before I start talking about these movies, I want to make one thing clear. You guys who don't listen out there, I need you to listen this time. I am talking about movies that involve B-17 bombers. I am not talking about movies that involve bombers in general. I am not talking about movies that involve American bombers in general. I am talking about movies that involve B-17 flying fortresses. So if you're not that good at identifying aircraft, don't get in the comments here and start saying, what about this film and what about that film and what about that film? Open your ears and listen. I'm talking about flying fortress movies. B-17, Boeing, B-17 flying fortress movies set in World War II. Okay? So don't give me a Vietnam film and ask me why I forgot that movie in the list, or give me a movie about B-25s over Tokyo or something like that. No. Are we good? Okay. The first two films that I would mention that need to be put on a list that aren't part of this trilogy, but they're adjacent to it. And this is an unofficial trilogy, mind you. These are the first Flying Fortress movies that ever came out. One was the film Flying Fortress in 1942, starring Richard Green. That film depicts a pilot who joins the Canadian ferrying group that's getting Lend-Lease B-17s to the Royal Air Force in England early in the war. What makes this movie so fascinating is that it has some of the earliest, rarest footage of B-17s, because the B-17 went through a huge amount of evolution in the 1930s before it attained its final form in World War II. It went through a lot of development, a lot of adjustments, a lot of tweaking. So those original B-17s, which are known as prototype and the A, B, C, and D models, they don't exist anymore except for one D. That's right, there is only one early style B-17 left in existence, and you can always identify them from their shark fin tail configuration. The B-17 E, F, and G, which were the mainstays of World War II for the American Air Forces, had the larger tails on them that were added because of the need for tweaking and the need to put a tail gunner position on the plane to protect it from enemy fighters coming from behind. So Flying Fortress, while not a memorable film in its own right, actually has footage of what looks to be either the original B-17 prototype in flight or it's possibly a B-17A. And it also has a very rare glimpse of RAF liveried B-17Cs, which is incredible when you consider that those planes weren't used by the RAF very long and they started to rely on their Lancasters and Stirlings and Halifaxes instead. The next movie that I would recommend is 1943's Air Force, directed by Howard Hawks. Now, this is a much better film than Flying Fortress. It's far more memorable, and it's far more of a hard recommendation. This is one that if you are a cinephile, I would recommend you watch this if you don't mind black and white movies. This is a really, really good movie. However, it also serves as kind of a prequel to the Flying Fortress films that I've put into this unofficial trilogy. The reason I'm calling this a prequel is because it's the fictionalized story of the B-17s that were headed to Pearl Harbor on the day that Pearl Harbor was attacked, which actually did happen. The events that happen after this in the film are, of course, made up, but they're not too far off from things that happened in the actual Pacific Theater. But the invaluable part of this movie, much like the 1942 Flying Fortress movie, is that this film provides a very rare glimpse of B-17 Cs and Ds that are actually converted B-17Bs. And there's a lot of footage of these planes, both on the ground and in the air, that is amazing to see because these planes, except for one, and it's not on display, they literally don't exist anymore. And for any aviation enthusiast, getting to see these planes in motion and with people moving around them at 35mm detail, that is a major, rare privilege. So I highly recommend to any aviation enthusiast who loves old warbirds, check out Howard Hawks' Air Force from 1943. And it's also just an exciting, fun movie on its own.
Well, there she is, sir.
Is room enough there to work a gun?
Sure, I'll show you. Hand me the gun when I get in.
Okay, now before we get into this unofficial trilogy, there are a few more films that I want to make sure you see. One is the William Wyler wartime documentary, Memphis Belle. That is the film that chronicled the Memphis Belle's final mission and told the American public at the time about how the air war in Europe with the 8th Air Force and the Flying Fortresses worked. It went through all of the gun positions. It went through what the Flying Fortress was comprised of as far as guns and technology and everything like that was still able to be told to the public because they kept a lot of stuff confidential. And it was also showing you the complexity of how they planned these bomb runs, while also showing you actual in-air combat footage. This was a documentary of the Memphis Belle and other crews in combat. There were actually people who worked on this film that went down with B-17 planes in combat. And William Wyler himself, the famous filmmaker who made Mrs. Miniver and a number of other great movies in history, he was in those planes as well, flying those combat missions, and lost hearing in one of his ears doing this film. So highly recommend it, and I would recommend you watch it off the Blu-ray called The Cold Blue, which is another documentary that's more recent that was made about the 8th Air Force Air War and the Flying Fortresses. But the amazing bonus feature here, and this is why I'm saying you should watch Memphis Belle on this, these guys who made this documentary, they were able to find the original camera negatives for William Wyler's Memphis Belle film. So instead of watching a third or fourth generation faded copy, which is those have been in circulation forever, this is your chance to see it in a pristine condition. And it is shocking to see this footage like it was shot yesterday. It will make you feel like you are standing next to these people. Because this film was shot in color, it brings World War II hauntingly close to home because of the amazing, perfect condition of the footage, both the combat footage and the footage on the ground. Suddenly, these people don't look like people in history anymore. They look like they could have been your neighbor or your friend in high school. It's really freaky, but in a good way. So I would highly recommend watching the original William Wyler documentary, Memphis Belle, off of the Blu-ray for Cold Blue. And then watch the Cold Blue documentary as well. It's excellent.
The friendly coast of England slips by below. It doesn't look like much now. But in a few hours, when you come back, if you come back, this will be the most beautiful view in the world.
Two more films, and then we're getting to our unofficial trilogy. The first film that I want to mention is Command Decision, 1948, starring Clark Gable. Now, this film, while it doesn't make it into my unofficial trilogy of B-17 films or television shows, I have to mention it because this is like the Darkest Hour movie with Gary Oldman for Battle of Britain. It's that equivalent. This is about the top brass commanders trying to justify, strategize, and deal with the strain of daylight bombing. But it is a post-war look back at what those commanders went through to justify and then live with themselves making those decisions. So this would be the equivalent of Darkest Hour if you were talking about, say, a series of Battle of Britain movies. This would occupy the place Darkest Hour occupies.
We got one more day to finish Operation Stitch. No matter what it costs. You know the answer to that.
The other one that I want to mention is the Steve McQueen film The War Lover, which is set at a 8th Air Force Air Base in World War II, and he is a Flying Fortress pilot. The thing about this movie is, while it is about a guy who has given up on life and he's got a death wish and he's in a war and war is hell and, you know, he already sees himself as a dead man, you know, it's got a lot of cliches in it like that. The reason I keep it outside these other films is, one, it recycles some footage from some of these earlier movies of the Flying Fortresses. It's not a bad film, but it is a movie that's leaning into that 60s era of wanting to say something about war in a way that is trying to be like a poem rather than just a straight up movie about the experience.
I once knew a man like you. Take and give nothing back.
Get wise, Daphne. The world belongs to the takers.
I would go so far as to compare this movie to A Midnight Clear. So if Masters of the Air is the band of brothers of B-17 film and television, then Midnight Clear is the war lover of the band of brothers type of movies. In other words, what the war lover does for the Flying Fortress B-17 8th Air Force genre, Midnight Clear does for the dog-face U.S. Army soldier rifleman at Bastogne kind of story. They're both trying to be half cinema, half poetry, trying to say something lofty about combat and death and all that kind of stuff. Again, some really good footage in here, worth watching, but The War Lover is not something that I would hold up as what I'm going to watch all the time or watch often, if that makes any sense.
You can't make love. You're twisted. You can only make hate.
Now, to the trilogy, the unintended B-17 Flying Fortress trilogy. First up is one of my favorite movies of all time, and that is 12 O'Clock High starring Gregory Peck. This was another post-war film like Command Decision, and it is set in the war like Command Decision, and it is about a bomb group in England in World War II in a location called Archbury, and they are at the beginning of the air war in 1942. And it's when the odds are low and the losses are high. And one particular bomb group who sees themselves as the hard luck group, they've had it, their commander has had it, they're all cracking under pressure, and they get Gregory Peck, who is a general, General Savage, to come in and fix the situation. And so he takes a hard line on things while trying to figure out how to boost morale and make the men more confident while improving their training and getting them back up in the air and making them understand that with better discipline they can have fewer losses, that kind of thing.
If there's a bombardier who can't hit his plate with his fork, you get him. If there's a navigator who can't find the men's room, you get him because you rate him. It's
an extremely good movie, an amazing character piece as well, with great performances by Peck and, of course, Dean Jagger, who I believe was nominated for an Oscar for this movie.
You've been drinking, Major.
I have. It's the first time I've been drunk in 20 years, but it may not be the last.
Really, really strong character study, as well as some really great footage of surviving B-17s from right after the war, which is key when you think about it, because this movie was made possible because right after the war, 1948-49, they still had enough B-17s in surplus that they could borrow, that they could use to convincingly restock these airfields that they made here in the United States to simulate England and do this film, and then use the actual combat wartime footage, because that was black and white like the movie is, to mix in seamlessly to make this film possible. But better than that, and more than just B-17s in the air and shooting at German fighters, what makes 12 O'Clock High so powerful is that it's starting to explore authentic wartime experiences and talk about them in an honest way. It's not trying to be poetry. It's not trying to, put the back of your hand up to your forehead and say, oh, I'm going to talk about this with a kind of, pretentious blah, blah, blah. It's not like that. But it is trying to be real. It's not using the real people's names, but it is taking real experiences and the real situation, and it is saying, this is what happened to guys like this in this theater of operations during World War II at this time. Extremely powerful film, highly recommended. I watch it probably 2 to 3 times a year, which I don't watch many movies. I don't even watch Star Wars that often, that many times a year. But this one is one that I can pop in anytime, no matter how I'm feeling, and I will just watch it. It is an amazing film. And if you're somebody that doesn't like black and white, this is the one where I would say try and get over it, because, and I don't mean that in a negative way, I mean truly try and get over not being able to plug into black and white. This movie is really, really good. And it is the beginning of my unofficial Flying Fortress 8th Air Force trilogy.
Now, I don't have a lot of patience with this what are we fighting for stuff. We're in a war, a shooting war. We've got to fight. And some of us have got to die.
The next one is the 1990 Memphis Belle film. This film was shepherded to the big screen by Catherine Weiler, the daughter of William Wyler, the famous filmmaker who ended up doing the wartime Memphis Belle movie. And this film is a sort of a historical pastiche of the actual Memphis Belle story. The names have been changed, so the personalities on the crew have been fictionalized heavily. Not really sure why they made that decision. It's one of the few criticisms that was levied against the film at the time by the actual veterans of the 8th Air Force, was it was trying to add interpersonal drama into the 10 guys that were on the plane.
We came here to bomb a factory. We're gonna bomb a factory, even if it means going around again.
You're crazy going around on a bomb run. It's suicide.
I don't know what he's saying.
You just do it! Rascal, there's nothing wrong with the ball turret.
Don't worry your pretty head about it, Burge.
Why'd you do that? Now we're even! Ah! Right.
That is this film's biggest failing, is that air crew on bombers, any multi-engine bomber in World War II, Flying Fortresses or B-24s or 26s or 25s or whatever, 29s, they didn't take their personal business up into the air. Because once you were up in the air, you all had to rely on each other for the slimmest chance of survival. You weren't going to sit there and complain about each other, you know, you ate more eggs than I did this morning, or, you know, I hate the fact that you stole my magazine or whatever. None of that would really have taken place. So there's a lot of that going on in this movie that isn't realistic. What is realistic, though, according to the veterans that watched it, this isn't me saying it, the veterans who were still alive at the time, including the majority of the Memphis Belle's actual crew, said that the combat depictions in this movie for its time were spot on.
Breaking out of 5 o'clock, Walter! Watch out!
The actual Memphis Belle 25th mission that's depicted in this film, the actual realism of the combat was spot on. The tension, what would happen to a plane, everything like that. What isn't realistic about this film in that regard is that the 25th and final mission of the Memphis Belle wasn't so simple and cut and dry. In other words, they fictionalize it going to a German location, Bremen.
The target for today is Bremen.
When in reality, it did not go to Bremen for its final mission. And also, the entire crew wasn't on the plane, and they didn't all complete the mission together at once. So you had the different 10 crew members who were having to catch up on different missions by flying in other planes occasionally. And then you had the plane itself, which had to complete its 25 missions.
We ain't going to Crowdville. Our plane's broke.
No, it's fixed.
Christ, let's go break it.
So in reality, even though it all got wrapped up by May 17th, 1943, all of it kind of happened slightly shuffled from one another. The film's depiction, of course, is that they were always on their plane and they were never on another plane, and anytime their plane was down, they were down, and then they all got back together and their plane got repaired for the 25th mission, and they did it, and now they're going home. And it's like, well, it wasn't really that simple in reality. And also, in truth, another plane actually did finish the missions first, the 25 mission tour of duty, and that was Hell's Angels. The difference being is that the Memphis Belle was the first to go home after that. That's its accolade, first to finish and go home. So this film, while it does accurately depict things that happened to a lot of B-17s in combat, it takes the final mission, puts it over a very dangerous target that the Bell did fly over on occasion during its tour of duty, just not on that final mission. And then it says, what were some of the most amazing things that happened to B-17s in combat while still making it home? Let's kind of throw everything, including the kitchen sink, at this fictionalized Memphis Belle for its final mission. So again, not a bad film, very, very watchable, engaging, entertaining movie. But just be aware that the only real parts of the film, as far as the history, are that there was a plane called the Memphis Belle, and it was one of the first to complete its 25 missions, and the rate of attrition and the casualty rates at that time were very, very, very high. And so it was an amazing achievement to be able to do that. It was a huge stroke of luck, and that's why they celebrated it. Very watchable, and it ends. This film takes place over like a 36-hour period, but it's May 16th and May 17th, 1943. So this film chronologically takes place after 12 o'clock high. And Memphis Belle, the actual airplane, came over in 42 at the same time that this movie takes place. So the Memphis Belle movie is kind of an important footnote in the history of the U.S. 8th Air Force Air War after 42 and into the spring of 43.
Bandit, 12 o'clock high. Look out, cockpit. He's heading straight for you. What am I supposed to do? Spit on him?
The final entry in this series is Masters of the Air itself. Masters of the Air starts approximately a week after May 17th, 1943. So it is chronologically after the historical and fictionalized Memphis Belle events. And it dovetails right into it nicely. And from what I understand, it's going to depict the evolution of the B-17s in the air war. In other words, those early E's and F's, the Memphis Belle was an F model, they will be upgraded to G models by the end of the war. And from what I've seen in some of the footage, the G's are going to be making an appearance, kind of like how Band of Brothers followed Easy Company from the beginning of the war to the end. This is going to follow the 100th Bomb Group from the beginning of the war to the end. So Masters of the Air is the miniseries cap-off to this whole chronology of the 8th Air Force war over Europe. Again, I don't know how that film miniseries is going to ultimately shake out, but so far we're 4 or 5 episodes in. I can't remember how many we are yet, and it's really solid, and it's extremely good. I know a lot of you guys aren't necessarily into old movies, and some of you aren't into maybe war history. For those of you who are into war history, for those of you who are into studying World War II, I highly implore you to try and start training your brain to watch older movies. You're missing out on so much archival rare footage that was roped into making Hollywood films at the time. If you're not watching these films, you're not even getting the experience of watching post-war footage when a lot of these aircraft and equipment were still in existence and still around. We're now in 2024, and the majority of these veterans have died off, and the airplanes themselves have died off. You know, the majority of them were scrapped in the intervening years after the war. There were fields and fields and fields of these airplanes, with thousands more coming back over the 2 oceans, and all of them were getting rounded up and pretty much decimated to be turned into Airstream trailers and other things. That did happen. That was actually what happened to them. They were cut up and turned into other products. That's what happened to them. And now we're in an era where even the few that are left, of I believe around 50, most of them are static displays in museums around the world. I have personally seen, I believe, 15 or 16 of them, which is a pretty good number. But of the few that are still flying, we've lost a scary number of them in the last few years, to the point that they were grounded, I believe last year or the year before, for mandatory FAA inspections in the United States due to their wing spars, because they have outlived their expiration date if they're still flying. And it's only a matter of time before we either lose the rest of the ones flying to accidents, or they all get permanently grounded and put in museums. I'm really glad that rare ones like the Memphis Belle have been fully restored, and the last B-17D, the Swoos, is currently being restored. But there are so many of these airplanes that never made it through history, not just in war, but then after the war. So these older movies are an amazing chance of seeing that footage that hasn't really been used in many documentaries or anything like that. But it was in concert with the U.S. Army Air Corps at the time for the purposes of getting more movies out there about the military and things like that. There's so much amazing footage, as well as just amazing stunt flying locked up in some of these films. If you are a World War II enthusiast and you're not watching these movies, you are doing yourself a disservice. You are shooting yourself in the foot.
Get a gun, shoot yourself in the foot, go home. Now that's good advice.
I hope this has been interesting for you guys. I hope if you're enjoying Masters of the Air that you continue to enjoy it. If you like Masters of the Air and this is your first time being exposed to the 8th Air Force Air War in Europe, I highly recommend the 3 movies that I just mentioned. Well, I should say 2 movies, because Masters of the Air, you're watching the end of the trilogy. Highly recommend 12 O'Clock High and then the 1990 Memphis Belle. And then the other 2 really, like, the other 2 big recommendations from me to you are Howard Hawks' Air Force from 1943 and William Wyler's wartime documentary, Memphis Belle, from 1944. Those 2 especially. The rest of them, like, your mileage may vary, but 12 O'Clock High, 1944 Memphis Belle, 1990 Memphis Belle, and Howard Hawks' 1943 Air Force are my definite top picks. The others, if you enjoyed this kind of stuff when you start watching it, then hit the others as well, because you'll enjoy them too. But yeah, this has been a big part of my life, as you can tell. And I'm really, really happy that Masters of the Air made it to production after so many years of waiting. I know that was only better in the long run because the technology could catch up. But as the technology was catching up for it, the number of B-17s available, if they needed real ones, was quickly diminishing. But I'm glad that the technology caught up to the point that they really didn't even need to worry about it. So that's good. If anybody's wondering why this is on the table, I'll close with this. This right here is a replica of the Toby jug that makes an appearance as a major plot device in 12 O'Clock High. Which is why it's next to this movie. This is an exact replica from Archbury Mint, and I had to have it in my collection because 12 O'Clock High is one of my favorite films of all time. All right. You guys go enjoy Masters of the Air. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below, and I will see you on the next video.
Well, good talking to you guys. Yep, take care. You too.